Donald Trump's brinkmanship with China has already dramatically backfired. After realizing the damage it would do to the United States economy, Trump has already exempted smartphones and other electronics from his 145% tariffs. What's more, the US has belatedly realized the damage China can cause if it halts exports of the materials and parts which are essential to US production. China has already halted the export of rare earths and magnets needed for the car and semiconductor industries, and China has now stopped exporting the jets Boeing needs to build its commercial airplanes. So how did Trump get his trade war so wrong? Well, on the one hand, the answer is simple. Donald Trump is a moron. But the Harvard-trained economist, Keyu Jin, thinks there's something deeper going on. Namely, not just Trump, but rather the entire Western political establishment just doesn't understand what's happening in Beijing and how strong the Chinese economy has become. Keyu Jin is currently Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics, and she's the author of the new China Playbook, Beyond Socialism and Capitalism. Keyu Jin is also a Chinese national, and she spoke to me from Beijing, and I began by asking whether she thinks China has already won Trump's trade war.
No one really wins from a trade war, and China is actually very not interested in engaging in any kind of trade war, but really is pushed into the stance of resistance, even fighting until the end, as the leaders say. It's very interesting, the perspective from inside China, where I am right now, where there's an almost consensus, whether it's the government or the people, then this is the right strategy to deal with Trump. Stay strong, hit the U.S. where it hurts until you can bring them back to rational dialogue. So there has been almost no debate about the fact that China has done these retaliatory tariffs and has held their position.
Yeah, and I wanted to know actually about attitudes in China to the trade war. It's been well publicized in the West how Canada responded to Trump's trade war. There was a rally around the flag, economic nationalism. Have we seen a similar thing going on in China?
Well, Trump really brought that onto China during his first presidency, really mobilized the whole nation, whether it's to undertake these technological leaps and advancements, or it's to give unity and more power to the central leadership, which is, I'm not sure this is what Washington, D.C. really wants. It has led the government to refocus on growth. And this time around, it is giving Beijing compelling force to double down on technological innovations, embrace new partners, including draw closer ties to the UK and Europe, to stimulate aggressively, to subsidize strategically, and to pivot tactically. It's given them this renewed confidence and unity around a single goal, which was kind of absent for a while. And I presume this is also true not only for Canada, but for also many other countries.
Yeah, and could we talk about the last 2 weeks in the context of the last 8 years when it comes to tariffs? So obviously this round of the trade war has been the most dramatic, the most chaotic. But in Trump's first term, he also introduced tariffs on China, which were then extended and to some degree sort of strengthened under Joe Biden. So yeah, could you talk about the trade war in a longer term perspective?
Actually, China has been preparing for this for a long time. For the last 8 years, at the very least, they are increasingly reducing their exposure to the U.S., really trying not to be at the mercy of the U.S., whether it comes to technology or the dollar or many other kind of dependencies. If you look at Trump 1.0 and what that has done to the Chinese economy, to the people, to the Chinese companies, well, first of all, it has set off a complete globalization frenzy among the Chinese companies. They have searched for new markets, opened new factories elsewhere, very, very resilient in adapting to new circumstances. Of course, there was short-term pain, but the Chinese people don't just lie flat, to use the phrase that is popular these days, which means to give up. They find new ways. And so that has started this complete trend. And I think the most significant is the growing tech autonomy. To be quite frank, a few years ago, China was in an existential crisis. They were really fearing being cut off from the critical components technology chain by the US, but it is no longer this position. You can argue that China is weak economically compared to a few years ago, but it is certainly technologically stronger. And more importantly, not only has it been able to fill a lot of the critical gaps in the tech supply chain over the last few years, thanks to US export controls, including Biden's export controls, but also the likes of pivotal economies like Japan and Korea have joined China's tech supply chain. Even if they're not fully committed, they are definitely hedging. So this time around, because of these highly aggressive, nonsensical, aggressive actions taken by President Trump's administration, it has really pushed other countries, and including Europe, dare I say, to work closely with China, again, hedging bets in light of the increasing U.S. unreliability.
And one big difference to me when it comes to sort of comparing the past 8 years to the past 2 weeks seems to be just how chaotic, how incompetent Trump has seemed over the past 2 weeks. You could maybe sort of pass a logic in his first term and under Joe Biden to what they were doing. Now, the rationale just seems unclear. And I want to know from you, I suppose, how much has the last 2 weeks, events since Liberation Day, as it was called, how much has that damaged the prestige of America in China?
Well, certainly the U.S. has damaged its reputation from the Trump 1.0 because, at least from the Chinese perspective, seems that all the actions are meant to suppress China, to prevent China from rising. And that is something that the Chinese people find unfair and unjust and very difficult to accept. This time around, it's almost been more of a joke. In some ways, the tariff rates have exceeded expectations, but the way he's been going about this, and also with the rest of the world, it just seems so completely ludicrous to the Chinese that it's not so much hatred and an emotional response that it has elicited, but just kind of curious what's going on. And doesn't he understand that this is damaging the U.S. reputation? Not more so in China, but also around the world, where U.S. credibility, the power of U.S. dollar, the power and the dominance of U.S. reputation over so many areas is completely in the midst of eroding or even crumbling. So I think that for the Chinese, it's pretty clear to them that a big bifurcation is happening.
And let's talk about some economic challenges that China does face, and I suppose ways they could respond to this trade war. And in particular here, lots of people have been talking about the challenge of increasing consumption. So China has had structurally very low consumption rates for a long time. And you've got a savings rate of about 44%, which means people are saving an enormous amount of their incomes. In the UK, for example, I think it's only 11%, the savings rate. So how can China increase consumption among Chinese people, and why have they struggled to do that so far?
Well, the Trump shock certainly has refocused the country back to domestic consumption. There is really no way out of this. It's not just about tension with the US, but also growing tension with the rest of the world, where weak consumption just simply means more exports of not only cheap apparel and textiles and toys this time around, but highly advanced components and technologies like EV batteries and so forth. And that creates a new kind of potential challenge for the rest of the world. And this is really only resolved by either China raising prices, that could be done by an exchange rate appreciation, but more importantly, by the domestic demand, which will, I believe, solve a lot of the issues at hand. Now, one of the core issues, and I think that this is not very well understood from the rest of the world, is that there are still hundreds of millions of people who reside in the countryside and in lower income households who still lack proper social protection and access to things like health and education. And in the short term, consumption is potentially weaker than it should be because of the cyclical problems, the uncertainty in jobs, the uncertainty in whether wages will rise in the future, and the young generation's frustration. But more deeply at the core is there's this vast group of people who haven't really made it to real middle income levels yet. And so their appetite to consume is very high. And this is why the Chinese government has now firmly shifted from supply side stimulus back to demand side stimulus. I doubt that it's going to work in China as it does in the US or the UK, handing out checks and, telling people go spend your money. That doesn't really work in China. But there are other ways potentially to, let's say, force consumption by giving you vouchers and things like that. These are marginal things, but that can get the engine going. In the end, China's big problem is this vast and geographical disparity. Undereducated, underemployed people living in the rural areas with urban cosmopolitan elites, many of whom have actually reached 30,000 or even 35,000 per capita income. And so closing that gap is the essential answer to raising demand. I do want to add in one cheeky, although very true, way of raising consumption, and that's have more kids. You know how much one of those costs. Have more kids and look, you'll spend more money, but you'll feel safer when you're old because at least one of them will turn out to be supportive and be nice to you. So you can save less.
And is there also a story about China which sort of links the birth rate and low consumption rates, which is connected to the lack of a welfare state in China? So I suppose, surprisingly for Western audiences, you've got a party called the Communist Party, which seems to be somewhat averse to rolling out a generous welfare state. Now, what that means is that people feel like they have to save money for a rainy day because the government won't step in and support them if they do become unemployed. I think pensions are very low as well. So to resolve this problem, to increase consumption in China so that they're not so reliant on exports, does the CCP need to reconsider the idea of having a strong welfare state rolled out across China?
I think this goes beyond a Communist Party issue. It is largely a cultural issue, where in China, having a very large welfare state, whether it's the government's mind or even the people's mind, tends to not induce hard work, which is really the foundation of the Chinese ethos. And so I think it's not just by government design that they have made that choice. I think the uncertainty about the future is a very real but a very recent thing, because Chinese people saw their income, their wages grow year on year, and their lives improving substantially. And their generations, the generations below them, their children's welfare improving substantially. So they had nothing to complain about, and they were less worried. But that has changed as the economy has gone into the more of a stagnant or even a recessionary situation in the last few years, and they have become more anxious. I don't think that their belief of a large welfare state is the solution to the uncertainties in the economy, but I do believe that they do need to have broader social protections. So pension needs to be broadly covered. And just to give you an example, someone who's living in the countryside was only 5% of the average pension of someone who's living in the urban areas, amounting to around, let's say, 40 pounds or so per month, which is not really enough. And then China also has a hukou system, which prevents migration of people from one province to another. So people, migrant workers, and there are 180 million of them in China, have very little access to schools and healthcare, even while they're working in cities. It's these kind of issues, specific issues, rather than broadening, enhancing, or providing a bigger welfare state, that I think is more important.
You move between the West and China a lot. You talk about Western perceptions of China and what we potentially get wrong. Now, one thing I've noticed in Western coverage of China is these wild swings between seeing the Chinese government as a hyper-competent organization and then essentially seeing it as a basket case. So some examples: at the beginning of COVID, everyone was saying China is the kind of government that can get things done. They can protect their people. Look at this. It's brilliant. It's phenomenal. By the end of the COVID period, when it seemed as if zero COVID had gone on a little bit too long, and the move away from it was somewhat botched, I think people saying, oh, this government's incompetent. No wonder they're a basket case. It's because it's a sort of personalistic dictatorship. We saw a similar thing when after 2008, that was probably the height, I think, of people saying China's government is brilliant. And that was the expansionary fiscal program that meant that China became the engine of growth for the world, really. Then in recent years, with the property bubble, And there's suddenly this narrative shift where it's, again, seen as this sort of useless country. Of course it's not working because it's not like us, and it's about to collapse. What do you make of this sort of competing idea that people have of the Chinese government as hyper competent and not competent at all, and the wild swings we see between these two positions?
Well, the West has roughly predicted 6 economic collapses in China since the 1980s, a period there in which China grew the fastest and for the longest in all human history. I think there is a little bit of irony there. Although, as you say, they do acknowledge the ways in which the Chinese government have been competent. I also want to remind us that very recently, the pendulum has swung wildly. 2 years ago, I was debating the concept of peak China, where people are bought into the idea that China's destiny is over. And guess now what happened recently? The DeepSeek moment, where, oh my goodness, China has caught up and in many ways can overtake the US. And last year in these large investor conferences, the topic was China uninvestable. Last month, I was in Hong Kong attending one of those again, and guess what the topic was? Oh, where should we put the money this year in China? So the pendulum is not only swinging 5 years at a time, but it's swaying from year to year. And I think it is really interesting. I think it's, people first of all think too much and worry too much about China in the West, if I may say so. There's almost an obsession about China in the way that is not really reciprocated by the Chinese, despite what's happening with Trump. But more importantly, there's not a lot of quality information flow, right? We tend to read the headline news and tend to have these very exaggerated responses, even emotional responses to things that are happening there. But we don't have quality information. The things are there. It's in Chinese language sources. Everything's there. I think one does grasp better what's going on with the materials there. It's not just government media. It's all kinds of decentralized media and content. But perhaps with DeepSeek, one could reduce that gap of information with China. I think that China is still on the right path, roughly the right path. It's made policy errors, just like, look, any country can make policy errors, whether it's Great Britain, whether it's Europe, and especially if it's US. And no system is immune to mistakes or centralized decision-making or even one-man rule, as it turns out. So I think the volatility is really around the world. It's global. The uncertainty is globally led. It's not China-led. But China being one of the largest economies in that is both subject to that, but also potentially a creator of global volatility as well.
I suppose we talked a lot about comparisons between the United States and China when it comes to their economy, the dynamism of their respective economies. What about politics? I mean, if we're entering this period of economic trade conflict between the United States and China, whose political system is most durable? Because, at the moment, again, you can look at America, say they've elected Donald Trump, this complete idiot. He doesn't seem to respect the Constitution. It seems like, maybe the American system is running out of steam. At the same time, they will have, presumably, an election in 2028. There'll be a transition to a different government. China still hasn't resolved the sort of transition problem, right? President Xi has increasingly created a personalistic style of rule. Could this be the real sort of Achilles heel of the Chinese system? What happens when President Xi, for one reason or another, steps down or no longer can fill that role?
Well, first of all, one word on technology. I think it is really important before answering your question. Look, China was comfortably importing the most advanced technological components from the US, from everyone else for a long period of time. And they did not bother making huge advances, especially in semiconductors. And even when they did try to, pour billions in making their own engines, planes, or automotives, they really failed. When did all this leap happen? It's when the possibilities are no longer there. It's the external pressure, especially if you cut it so tight that there's no chance. It's like you're in a room without oxygen and oxygen is going down. What do you think happens there? The Chinese people, they're smart. they'll figure things out. There's scale, there's funding. Basically, they were forced to do this in a very short period of time. And that is exactly what's going on with AI and semiconductors. And I think as we look into the future, and by the way, China is really the only developing country in the history of the world that can actually do cutting edge technology on a broad-based level. But going forward, the focus is really squarely on innovation to reduce cost. And from what I'm hearing and learning, it's not just AI, it's in the semiconductor space. Obviously, it's already happening in the EV space and many others. Their focus on problem solving, on reducing cost through innovation is a very particular route and approach that I don't think actually collides with the American approach, actually complements it. And then ultimately, the global consumers will benefit as well. So I don't think this is an approach to be rejected. Back to your question, I want to argue that there is continuity in China more than perhaps in many other Western democracies. And we've seen continuity. We've seen changes in the paths, but we've seen roughly continuity. And that has led to some degree of stability. Stability is more important than anything else for the Chinese government. You can see it in the financial sector. You can see it in the economic sphere. You can see it in the social sphere. It's all about stability. So I argue that a lot of these policies don't really, at least on the surface, deliver a great deal of instability, at least not intentionally. Succession, of course, is a really interesting topic here. I don't have much to comment because I don't know. I don't think anyone knows much about it at this point. But I think in the global arena, what has happened recently has gone to show that China, more than the US, has become an anchor of global stability, which is interesting. It's a flipping of the fate. As you look at the responses of other countries right now, as you look at, China, Japan, South Korea in 5 years, first time resuming the trilateral cooperation in the midst of this growing uncertainty coming from the US. If you look at China and RCEP pushing zero tariffs for 54 sectors, and if you look at President Xi's recent visit to Southeast Asia, which has been the hardest hit victims of Trump's tariff wars, I think the perception is changing. So stability is the most important thing, although I think that when we look for disruptions, especially technological innovation, even the financial system, to really leap onto a different level, disruption is important. But still, I'd say China would prize stability over that.
And let's talk about the issue that will probably worry our audience most, and that's the possibility of military conflict. So the language, at least in the West, when it comes to tensions between the US and China, increasingly seems like this is now one of military competition as well as economic competition. Some people have suggested it can be quite easy in history for trade wars to bleed into military conflicts if a country feels pushed against the wall or if there's nothing to lose. What are the dangers? So, and I want to know what you're hearing as you're currently in China about the possibilities of this trade war translating into some form of military conflict. And obviously Taiwan would be the clearest potential flashpoint here.
This time is a bit different from the first interaction with President Trump and his administration. At that point, there was no rupture. There was still room for negotiation, and there was a goal to fix the issues. This time, if you look at the almost prohibitive tariff rates that have been mutually imposed on each other, and the Treasury Secretary in the US saying that everything is on the table, including delisting Chinese companies from the US stock markets. I think that's just raised the stakes of the military conflict. If really everything is put on the table, I think there has been a lot of restraint practiced by the Chinese government over issues such as Taiwan, understanding that the potential international backlash or pushback will be quite severe and negatively affect China. But if the US goes about singling out China in this matter, blackmailing China in this matter, and really starting a huge rupture, face off, basically, event with China, then I think there is less to lose in that specific issue. So I am a bit more concerned, although I have to say that I think there are lots of ways the Chinese government is thinking about getting closer to Taiwan and resolving the cross-strait disputes, at least from what I'm hearing. Military confrontation is really the very last step. Even something like a blockade, as frightening as that might sound as well, seems more likely as an outcome than a real showdown.
Now, I have to say that's not a very reassuring answer. Obviously, a blockade over Taiwan would be a big escalation. So do you think that we could see a big flare-up over Taiwan during the Trump presidency?
I mean, things are all thrown out of this very rational framework at this point. So I'm not sure that you can make predictions based on rational game theoretic arguments here. Look, I think the Chinese are still trying to stay calm. If you look at their responses, it's been focused on trade, solely on tariffs trade, not trying to expand that beyond into other areas in the way that the U.S. Treasury Secretary has hinted, but staying very focused. Even the foreign ministry has not come in to say anything. So I think they're still practicing a great amount of restraint. So if that is of any comfort, I think that they will use full comprehensive deliberation on this issue. But look, things are so wild at this point, who knows?
And I've just got one last question for you. So the new China Playbook, Beyond Capitalism and Socialism, that's the title of your latest book from 2023. It's a topic that will very much interest our audience. I think the debate between capitalism and socialism. You're saying, I think, China is neither capitalist nor socialist. It's a third thing. Is that correct?
It's something that blends both. I do think that these labels, black or white, are no longer appropriate. But really, China has demonstrated that there's not just one model that can work, right? The Western liberal democratic economic model is not the only way to go. You could have market competition at the same time you have state coordination and state mobilization, and you can have communalism over individualism that does not suppress innovation and disruption. And you can have a more balanced society where economic efficiency is not the only thing that matters, but also what's socially desirable and harmonious, harking back to the Confucian philosophy of really getting along and coexistence.